My name is Margaret Williams, and I never thought I would be telling this story. For 73 years, I believed that family meant everything, that the bonds of blood were unbreakable, that a mother's love would always be returned in kind. The morning I discovered the truth, the October air carried the scent of dying leaves through my kitchen window, and I was sipping coffee from the same blue ceramic mug I had used for 25 years. The phone call that shattered my world came at exactly 8:47 in the morning, because I remember looking at the digital clock on my microwave when the real estate agent's voice cut through the peaceful silence of my home. Mrs. Williams, I'm calling about the sale of your property at 421 Maple Street. The closing is scheduled for tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, and we need to confirm your attendance. The words hit me like ice water. My fingers went numb around the warm mug, and I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. The familiar sounds of my neighborhood, the distant hum of traffic and children playing in the yard next door, suddenly felt foreign and threatening. I'm sorry, there must be some mistake, I managed to whisper, my voice cracking like autumn leaves underfoot. I haven't put my house up for sale. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for what felt like an eternity. I could hear papers shuffling, the tap of computer keys, the soft intake of breath that told me this woman was about to deliver news that would change everything. Ma'am, according to our records, the sale was initiated by your power of attorney, James Williams. He's been handling all the paperwork on your behalf. The buyer is quite eager to close, and we've already processed the earnest money. James. My son James. The boy I had raised after his father died in a construction accident when he was only 12. The young man I had worked double shifts at the diner to put through college. The son who had promised to take care of me in my golden years, who had moved back to town 3 years ago specifically to be closer to his aging mother. The coffee mug slipped from my nerveless fingers and shattered against the linoleum floor, sending hot liquid and ceramic shards across the kitchen I had cleaned every morning for 38 years. The crash echoed through the house like a gunshot, and I found myself staring at the brown puddle spreading across the worn pattern of yellow flowers, the same linoleum I had chosen when James was in high school and had complained it looked too old-fashioned. Mrs. Williams? Are you there? I forced myself to focus on the voice, though it sounded like it was coming from underwater. Yes, I'm here. Can you please tell me exactly what paperwork you have? Of course. Let me pull up the file. More clicking, more shuffling. Each sound felt amplified in my suddenly oversensitive state. We have a power of attorney document dated 6 months ago, giving James Williams full authority to handle all real estate transactions on your behalf. It's notarized and appears to be in perfect order. The listing agreement was signed 4 weeks ago, and we've had quite a bit of interest in the property. It's a lovely home, Mrs. Williams. The buyers are planning to renovate and flip it. 4 weeks ago. I thought back to that time, trying to remember anything unusual. 4 weeks ago, I had been recovering from a minor bout of pneumonia. James had been so attentive, bringing me soup, picking up my medications, handling my mail because I was too weak to walk to the mailbox. He had been the perfect son, worried and caring, insisting I rest and let him take care of everything. Let him take care of everything. I never signed any power of attorney, I said, my voice gaining strength even as my legs felt like they might give out beneath me. And I certainly never authorized the sale of my home. Another pause. This one felt different, heavier with implication and legal consequence. Mrs. Williams, I think you need to contact your attorney immediately. If what you're saying is true, we may be looking at a case of fraud. In the meantime, I'm going to put a hold on tomorrow's closing and contact our legal department. After I hung up the phone, I stood in my kitchen surrounded by broken ceramic and spilled coffee, feeling like a stranger in my own home. The afternoon sunlight streaming through the lace curtains my mother had made suddenly felt harsh and exposing. Every familiar object, from the collection of ceramic roosters on the windowsill to the family photos covering the refrigerator, seemed to mock me with their normalcy. I had lived in this house for 38 years. Harold and I had bought it as newlyweds, full of dreams and plans for the future. We had painted every room together, planted the rose garden that still bloomed each spring, refinished the hardwood floors in the living room while I was pregnant with James. After Harold died, this house had been my sanctuary, my security, the one constant in a life that had been turned upside down by unexpected loss. Now my own son was trying to steal it from me. The thought was so alien, so impossible, that I almost convinced myself there had been some terrible misunderstanding. James would never do this. Not my James, who had cried in my arms the night his father died, who had graduated summa cum laude from State University, who had given the most beautiful speech at my 70th birthday party about how I had sacrificed everything for him and how he would spend the rest of his life making sure I was taken care of. But as I swept up the broken pieces of my coffee mug, each shard sharp enough to draw blood, I began to remember other things. Small things that hadn't seemed important at the time but now took on a sinister new meaning. 3 months ago, James had suggested I might want to think about updating my will and other important documents. He had even recommended a lawyer, his friend Derek from college, who had recently started practicing elder law. Derek had seemed professional and knowledgeable, and James had insisted on driving me to the appointment and sitting in on the meeting because he was concerned about my health and wanted to make sure I understood everything. 2 months ago, James had convinced me to let him handle my finances, arguing that I was getting forgetful and might accidentally pay bills twice or forget to pay them at all. He had been so patient and understanding, pointing out gently that I had indeed forgotten to pay the electric bill the month before, something that had never happened in my entire adult life. He had taken over my checking account, my savings, even my Social Security payments, promising to give me a weekly allowance and handle all the household expenses. 6 weeks ago, he had started talking about how big and empty the house felt, how expensive it was to maintain, how much happier I might be in a nice senior living community where I could have friends my own age and wouldn't have to worry about cooking and cleaning. He had brought me brochures for places with names like Sunset Manor and Golden Years Residence, glossy pamphlets full of smiling elderly faces and promises of enriching activities and round-the-clock care. I had told him I wasn't ready for any of that I wanted to stay in my own home for as long as possible. He had smiled and patted my hand and said of course, we would wait until I was ready, there was no rush at all. But apparently, there was a rush. Apparently, while I was recovering from pneumonia and trusting my son to take care of everything, he had been forging my signature and stealing my home. The more I thought about it, the more the pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. The way he had insisted on handling all my mail during my illness. The way he had suddenly become so interested in my legal documents. The way he had been pushing me towards senior living communities with increasing urgency over the past few weeks. And then there were the phone calls. For the past month, James had been taking phone calls in another room, calls that seemed to make him agitated and secretive. When I asked about them, he always had a ready explanation. Work stress. A difficult client. Problems with his girlfriend Lisa. But now I wondered if those calls had been from real estate agents, lawyers, buyers eager to purchase my home while I remained blissfully unaware of the betrayal unfolding around me. I needed proof. I needed to see the documents, to understand exactly what had been done in my name. But first, I needed to sit down before I fell down. My legs were shaking so badly I could barely walk to the living room, where I collapsed into Harold's old recliner, the worn leather still shaped to his body after all these years. The house felt different now, poisoned by knowledge I couldn't unknow. The creaking of the floorboards overhead, sounds I had found comforting for decades, now seemed ominous. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, a wedding gift from Harold's parents, sounded like a countdown to disaster. I closed my eyes and tried to think rationally. There had to be an explanation. Maybe James had been trying to help in some misguided way. Maybe he genuinely believed I needed to be in a care facility and thought this was the kindest way to make it happen. Maybe the power of attorney was legitimate, and I had signed it during my illness when I wasn't thinking clearly. But even as I tried to convince myself of these possibilities, I knew in my heart they weren't true. I remembered every document I had ever signed, every legal paper I had ever put my name to. I would never have signed away my right to control my own property, especially not without understanding exactly what I was doing. The phone rang again, making me jump. For a moment, I considered not answering it, afraid of what other horrible news might be waiting for me. But when I saw James's name on the caller ID, I knew I had to face this head-on. "Hi, Mom." His voice was warm and cheerful, exactly the same as it had been every day for the past 3 years. "How are you feeling today? Did you eat lunch?" The casual normalcy of his tone made my stomach turn. How could he sound so caring, so concerned about my welfare, when he was in the process of destroying my life? James, I said, my voice steadier than I felt, I just got a very strange phone call from a real estate agent. She said something about a closing tomorrow morning for the sale of my house. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. I could picture him in his apartment across town, probably standing in his modern kitchen with its granite counters and stainless steel appliances, the kitchen I had helped him pick out when he moved back to town because he said he wanted to be closer to his family. To me. Mom, he said finally, and now his voice sounded different, careful, and measured, we need to talk. I was going to tell you about this, but I wanted to wait until everything was finalized. Tell me about what, exactly? I gripped the phone tighter, my knuckles white with tension. About the house sale. Mom, you know we've talked about this. The house is too much for you to handle, and you're not getting any younger. I found a beautiful assisted living facility with an opening, and the money from the house sale will more than cover the costs. You'll be so much happier there, with people your own age and activities to keep you busy. Each word hit me like a physical blow. The casual way he spoke about selling my home, about making these massive life decisions without my knowledge or consent, was almost more shocking than the fraud itself. James, I never authorized you to sell my house. I never signed any power of attorney giving you that right. Another pause, longer this time. When he spoke again, his voice had changed completely. Gone was the warm, caring sun. In its place was someone I didn't recognize, someone cold and calculating and utterly without remorse. Mom, you're not remembering clearly. You were very sick 6 months ago, much sicker than you realize. The doctor was concerned about your mental state, and you asked me to help you get your affairs in order. You signed the power of attorney in Derek's office, with proper witnesses and notarization. It's all completely legal. That's not true. I was surprised by the strength in my own voice. I would remember signing something that important. Would you, though? His tone was patient now, condescending, the way you might speak to a confused child. Mom, you've been having memory problems for a while now. Forgetting to pay bills, losing track of appointments, repeating stories. It's part of getting older, and there's no shame in it, but you can't live independently anymore. This is the best solution for everyone. The gaslighting was so smooth, so practiced, that for a moment I almost doubted myself. Had I been more confused during my illness than I remembered? Had I signed documents I couldn't recall? But then I thought about the real estate agent's call, about the closing scheduled for tomorrow morning, about the buyers who were planning to renovate and flip my beloved home. If James really believed he was acting in my best interests, why had he kept all of this secret? Why hadn't he discussed the timing with me, shown me the assisted living facility he had chosen, involved me in any of the decisions about my own life? James, even if I did sign something during my illness, I'm telling you now that I want to stay in my home. I'm not ready for assisted living, and I don't want to sell the house. Surely that matters. Mom, it's too late for that. The sale is already in motion, and I've put a deposit down on your room at Sunset Manor. You're going to love it there. They have a craft room and a library, and they serve 3 meals a day so you won't have to worry about cooking anymore. Sunset Manor. One of the brochures he had shown me, with its bland institutional decor and its promises of structured activities and managed care. I had looked at the photos of residents sitting in wheelchairs in a sterile common room and told him firmly that I wasn't ready for anything like that. What if I refused to leave? I asked, though I already knew the answer would terrify me. Mom, you don't have a choice. The house is sold. The closing is tomorrow morning, and the new owners want to take possession immediately. I've already arranged for a moving company to pack up your things on Saturday morning. I've tried to make this as easy as possible for you. As easy as possible. He had stolen my home and my independence and my right to make my own decisions, and he was presenting it as a kindness. Where are you right now? I asked. I'm at work. Why? I want to see the power of attorney document. I want to see exactly what I supposedly signed. Mom, we can go over all the paperwork later. Right now, you need to focus on getting ready for the move. I'll come over tonight and help you decide what you want to take with you to Sunset Manor. I want to see it now, James. Today. He sighed, the long-suffering sound of someone dealing with a difficult and unreasonable elderly person. The sound made my blood boil, because I recognized it as an act, a performance designed to make me feel guilty for questioning his authority. Fine. I'll stop by after work with all the documents. But Mom, fighting this isn't going to change anything. Everything has been done properly and legally. The best thing you can do is accept the situation and try to be positive about your new living arrangement. After he hung up, I sat in Harold's chair and cried for the first time since my husband's funeral 15 years ago. I cried for the naive trust one had placed in my son, for the security I had thought was unshakable, for the home I was about to lose. But mostly, I cried for the relationship that had been destroyed by greed and selfishness, for the son I thought I knew who had turned out to be someone completely different. When the tears finally stopped, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades, a burning, focused rage. James might have outmaneuvered me, but I wasn't going to make it easy for him. I wasn't going to go quietly into the sterile, controlled environment he had chosen for me. I was going to fight. I called my doctor first, Dr. Patricia Chen, who had been treating me for over a decade. Her receptionist tried to tell me there were no appointments available until next week, but when I explained that I needed documentation of my mental competency for a legal matter, Dr. Chen agreed to see me that afternoon. The drive to her office felt surreal. I had driven these same streets thousands of times, past the elementary school where James had played Little League baseball, past the diner where I had worked for 22 years, past the church where Harold and I had been married. Now I was seeing everything through the lens of impending loss, wondering if this might be one of the last times I would navigate the familiar roads of the town where I had built my entire adult life. Dr. Chen was a small, efficient woman in her 50s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She had delivered the news of my pneumonia diagnosis 6 months ago with gentle concern, had prescribed the antibiotics that cleared up the infection, had assured me that my recovery was proceeding normally. "Margaret," she said as I sat in her examination room, trying not to fidget on the crinkly paper covering the exam table, "you sounded very upset on the phone. What's going on?" I told her everything. About the phone call from the real estate agent, about James's confession that he had been orchestrating the sale of my home, about his claims that I had signed legal documents while mentally compromised during my illness. Dr. Chen listened without interruption, occasionally making notes in my file. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, her expression thoughtful and increasingly troubled. "Margaret, I need to be very clear about something. During your treatment for pneumonia 6 months ago, you were never mentally incapacitated. You had a respiratory infection, not a neurological condition. Your cognitive function was completely normal throughout your illness and recovery. But James said the doctor was concerned about my mental state." "Which doctor?" "Because it certainly wasn't me. You were alert, oriented, and capable of making your own medical decisions at all times. I would never have suggested that you needed someone else to handle your legal affairs." She pulled out a prescription pad and began writing. "I'm going to document your current mental status for your legal proceedings. I'll also provide a written statement about your condition during your pneumonia treatment. Margaret, what your son has done sounds like elder abuse, and I'm legally required to report it to Adult Protective Services." Adult Protective Services. The phrase made me feel simultaneously validated and humiliated. I was a victim, someone who needed protection from her own child. Will that help me keep my house? I can't say for certain, but it will create an official record of what's happened. You need to contact a lawyer immediately, someone who specializes in elder law and fraud cases. And Margaret? You might want to consider staying somewhere else tonight. If your son is desperate enough to forge legal documents, there's no telling what he might do when he realizes you're fighting back. The suggestion that I might be in physical danger from James seemed impossible, but then again, 24 hours ago I would have said it was impossible that he would steal my home. I was learning that the impossible had a way of becoming reality when it came to my son. I drove home in a daze, Dr. Chen's medical evaluation and written statement in my purse like a shield against James's lies. The afternoon had turned gray and overcast, matching my mood, and the first few leaves were beginning to fall from the maple tree in my front yard, the tree that had given our street its name. 421 Maple Street. I had always loved our address, had taken pride in the way our house looked from the curb with its white picket fence and carefully tended flower beds. Harold had painted that fence 3 times during our marriage, always the same crisp white, always with the same meticulous attention to detail he brought to everything he did. Now I wondered if I would ever see another spring in this house, ever plant another flower or watch another season change from my living room window. The phone was ringing when I walked through the front door. I almost didn't answer it, afraid it might be James calling with more lies and manipulation, but the caller ID showed my sister Linda's name. Linda lived in Phoenix with her retired husband Bob, and we talked every Sunday without fail. She was 3 years older than me and had always been protective of her little sister, even now that we were both well into our 70s. "Maggie," she said, using the childhood nickname only she still called me, "you sound terrible." "What's wrong?" I told her everything, just as I had told Dr. Chen, but with Linda I could let my emotions show. I cried again as I described the betrayal, the fear, the sense of having been utterly deceived by someone I loved more than my own life. "That son of a bitch," Linda said when I finished, her voice blazing with fury. "Harold would roll over in his grave if he knew what that boy was doing to you. Maggie, you can't let him get away with this. I don't know how to stop him. He says everything is legal, that I signed the documents and just don't remember." "Bullshit. You've got the sharpest memory of anyone I know. You can still recite phone numbers from 40 years ago and remember the exact dates of every important event in our family history. There's no way you signed away your house and forgot about it." She paused, and I could hear her thinking, the way she used to when we were children and she was planning some elaborate scheme to get us out of trouble. "Listen, Bob's cousin Rick is a lawyer in Phoenix. He specializes in elder fraud cases. I'm going to call him right now and see if he can recommend someone good in your area. In the meantime, you need to get copies of everything. Bank statements, legal documents, anything James has been handling for you. And Maggie? Don't trust him with anything else. Not your medication, not your mail, nothing." After Linda hung up, promising to call back as soon as she had spoken to her husband's cousin, I walked through my house like a detective examining a crime scene. How much evidence of James's deception had I missed? What other signs had I ignored or rationalized away? In the kitchen, I found a stack of mail I hadn't seen before, tucked into the drawer where I usually kept my grocery coupons. Bills from the electric company, the water department, my homeowner's insurance, all stamped paid in James's handwriting. When had he moved my mail from the kitchen counter to this drawer? And why? I opened each envelope carefully, comparing the signatures on the payment stubs to my own handwriting. They were close, very close, but not perfect. The M in Margaret was slightly different, the loop and the G not quite right. If I hadn't been looking for forgery, I might not have noticed, but now that I knew what to look for, the differences were obvious. How long had he been forging my signature on routine bills and documents, practicing until he could reproduce it well enough to fool a notary? In the living room, I found more evidence of James's secret activities. The landline phone next to Harold's chair had a notation in the margin of the phone book, a phone number written in James's distinctive printing with the words "RE agent" next to it. Real estate agent. He had been conducting business related to the sale of my home right under my nose, using my own phone while I was probably napping upstairs or working in the garden. The violations felt endless, each new discovery like a fresh betrayal. My son had treated my home like his own personal property, had made himself comfortable conducting his fraudulent business in the living room where his father used to read the evening paper. By the time James arrived that evening, I had assembled a small mountain of evidence. Forged signatures, suspicious phone numbers, bank statements showing transactions I hadn't authorized. I was no longer the confused, grieving woman who had answered the phone that morning. I was angry, and I was ready for war. He let himself in with the key I had given him 3 years ago, back when his unexpected return to our hometown had seemed like a blessing rather than a curse. I heard his footsteps in the hallway, the familiar sound of his leather shoes on the hardwood floor, and for just a moment I felt the old surge of maternal love and pride. Then I remembered what he had done, and the love curdled into something cold and bitter. "Hi, Mom," he called out, his voice artificially cheerful. I brought Chinese food. Your favorite from Golden Dragon. He appeared in the living room doorway carrying white takeout containers, looking for all the world like the devoted son bringing dinner to his elderly mother. He was still handsome at 43, with Harold's strong jaw and my dark eyes, dressed in the expensive business casual clothes that had always made me proud of his success. I brought all the paperwork you wanted to see, he continued, setting the food on the coffee table and pulling a manila folder from his briefcase. I thought we could go over everything while we eat. I remained seated in Harold's chair, making no move toward the food or the documents. Before we look at anything, I want you to answer a question. Do you remember your father's funeral? The non sequitur caught him off guard, and for a moment his careful mask slipped. Of course I remember Dad's funeral. What does that have to do with anything? Do you remember what you said to me that day? What you promised me at the graveside? James set down his briefcase and looked at me with what might have been genuine confusion. Mom, that was 15 years ago. I don't remember exactly what I said. I do. I remember every word. You took my hands and you looked me right in the eyes, and you said, Mom, Dad made me promise to take care of you for the rest of your life. You'll never have to worry about anything as long as I'm here. I'll make sure you're safe and happy and that you can stay in your own home for as long as you want. The memory hung in the air between us, and I watched my son's face as he processed the implications. He had made that promise in front of 47 mourners, including his Uncle David who had driven down from Chicago, and Mrs. Patterson from next door who had brought casseroles for a week after the service. Mom, I meant that. I still mean it. That's exactly what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to make sure you're safe and taken care of. By stealing my house? By forging my signature on legal documents? By lying to me for months while you arranged to sell my home without my knowledge or consent? His composure cracked completely then, or maybe he simply decided there was no point in pretending anymore. The caring, concerned son vanished, replaced by someone calculating and cold. It's not stealing when it's necessary, he said, his voice flat and matter-of-fact. Mom, you're 73 years old. You live alone in a house that's too big for you, in a neighborhood that's not as safe as it used to be. You had pneumonia 6 months ago, and it could have been much worse if I hadn't been checking on you regularly. What happens the next time you get sick? What happens when you fall down the stairs or forget to turn off the stove? Those are risks I'm willing to take to stay in my own home. Well, they're not risks I'm willing to let you take. He opened the manila folder and spread papers across the coffee table like evidence in a trial. The power of attorney is legitimate, Mom. You signed it during your illness when you were scared and realized you needed someone to help you manage your affairs. I leaned forward to examine the documents, and my heart sank. The signature looked perfect, better than the practice forgeries I had found on the utility bills. The notary stamp was official, the witness signatures appeared genuine, and the date matched James's timeline exactly. Derek Hansen, the notary, I said, reading the name on the stamp. Your friend from college. Derek's a licensed notary public and a practicing attorney. Everything was done by the book. But something about the document bothered me, something beyond the impossibility of me having signed it. The paper looked wrong, too white and crisp for something that was supposedly 6 months old. And the ink from the pen used to sign it had a slightly different color than the rest of the document, as if it had been added later. I want to take this to a handwriting expert, I said. James laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. Mom, you're welcome to waste your money on experts and lawyers, but it won't change anything. The document is legal, the sale is proceeding, and you're moving to Sunset Manor on Saturday morning. I've already paid the first month's rent. What if I refuse to go? Then I'll have you declared mentally incompetent and have you committed involuntarily. Derek says it's not difficult when someone is clearly unable to make rational decisions about their own welfare. The threat hung in the air like poison gas. My own son was willing to have me declared insane and locked away rather than let me keep my independence. The James I had raised, who had once written me Mother's Day cards full of heartfelt gratitude and love, was capable of destroying my life without apparent remorse. Why? I whispered. Why are you doing this to me? For a moment, something flickered across his face. Guilt, maybe, or the ghost of the love he used to feel for me. But it was gone so quickly I might have imagined it. Because I need the money, he said simply. My business is failing, Mom. I'm 6 months behind on my rent, I owe more on my car than it's worth, and I've got credit card debt up to my eyeballs. The equity in this house is the only thing standing between me and bankruptcy. There it was. The truth, finally, spoken without pretense or manipulation. My son was stealing my home to pay his debts, and he was willing to destroy our relationship and my peace of mind to do it. I would have helped you, I said. If you had come to me honestly and explained your situation, I would have found a way to help. With what? Your Social Security barely covers your own expenses. And I'm not looking for a loan, Mom. I need enough money to start over, to get out from under all this debt and build a new life. This house is worth $300,000. After I pay off your medical bills and the cost of your care at Sunset Manor, there should be enough left to give me a fresh start. Medical bills? I don't have any outstanding medical bills. James smiled, and it was the coldest expression I had ever seen on my child's face. You will. Sunset Manor is expensive, Mom. Very expensive. And elderly people need a lot of medical care. It's amazing how quickly costs can add up. The implication was clear. He was planning to spend my money from the sale of my house, on expensive care I didn't need or want, while pocketing whatever was left over. I would be trapped in an institutional setting, dependent on his financial management, while he systematically looted my life savings. You've thought of everything, haven't you? I've tried to. I'm not proud of what I'm doing, Mom, but I don't have a choice. I'm 43 years old, and this is my last chance to turn my life around. In 5 or 10 years, when you're gone, I'll be too old to start over. When you're gone. He was talking about my death as if it were a business consideration, a factor in his financial planning. The son I had given birth to, nursed through childhood illnesses, supported through college, welcomed back home with such joy, was counting on my death to solve his problems. I stood up slowly, my legs unsteady but my resolve rock solid. Get out of my house. Mom, we need to finish going over these documents. Get out. Now. And leave the key. James looked at me for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether to escalate the confrontation. Then he gathered up his papers, closed his briefcase, and walked toward the front door. The closing is still tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, he said without turning around. With or without your cooperation, this house will be sold. You can make this easy on yourself by accepting the situation, or you can make it difficult and achieve the same result anyway. After he left, I sat in the gathering darkness of my living room and tried to process what had just happened. My son, the person I loved most in the world, had just threatened to have me declared mentally incompetent if I interfered with his plan to steal my home. The child I had sacrificed everything for was willing to sacrifice me for money. But I wasn't helpless, and I wasn't giving up. Linda called back just after 8 o'clock with the name and phone number of an attorney in the state capital, a woman named Sarah Martinez who specialized in elder fraud and had successfully stopped similar real estate scams. She can't see you until Monday, Linda said, but she says if you can prove the documents were forged, she can get an emergency injunction to stop the sale. Do you think you can prove it? I thought about the crisp white paper, the slightly different ink color, Derek Hansen's convenient appearance as both notary and James's college friend. I think so. But Linda, what if I can't? What if James really has covered all his tracks? Then you come stay with Bob and me in Phoenix until we figure out another plan. Maggie, you're not facing this alone. But first, you need to get somewhere safe tonight. I don't trust that boy not to try something desperate. She was right. If James was willing to commit fraud and threaten involuntary commitment, there was no telling what other lines he might be willing to cross. I packed a small overnight bag and drove to the Comfort Inn on the other side of town, paying for the room with cash I kept hidden in an old jewelry box in my bedroom. The motel room was clean but impersonal, with generic artwork and the lingering smell of industrial carpet cleaner. I had never felt more alone in my life, sitting on the edge of the narrow bed and staring at the legal documents James had left behind. but as I studied the power of attorney more closely, hope began to flicker in my chest. The document had several problems that might be enough to prove forgery. The signature, while close to mine, had subtle differences in pressure and letter formation. The date was supposedly from a day when I had been at Dr. Chen's office for a follow-up appointment, something I could prove with medical records. Most importantly, the witness signature claimed to be from Mrs. Patterson, my elderly neighbor, but I knew for a fact that Mrs. Patterson had been visiting her daughter in Florida 6 months ago during the exact time period when the document was supposedly signed. I spent most of the night making notes and organizing evidence, driven by a clarity of purpose I hadn't felt in years. By morning, I had built what I hoped was a solid case for fraud. The first thing I did after the continental breakfast was call Sarah Martinez's office and leave a detailed message explaining my situation and the evidence I had gathered. Then I called the real estate office. "Mrs. Williams," the agent said, her voice carefully professional, "I'm glad you called. We've postponed this morning's closing pending resolution of the ownership questions you raised yesterday. However, I need to inform you that the buyers are getting impatient, and if this matter isn't resolved quickly, they may withdraw their offer and pursue legal action for their expenses." "Let them," I said, surprising myself with the steel in my voice. "I never authorized this sale, and I'm prepared to prove it in court." My next call was to Derek Hansen's law office. When his secretary tried to schedule me for an appointment the following week, I told her I was calling about a notarization he had performed 6 months ago that was now being questioned in a fraud investigation. Derek took my call within 5 minutes. "Mrs. Williams," he said, his voice smooth and professional, "James told me you might be confused about the power of attorney document." "It's completely understandable. Legal paperwork can be overwhelming, especially when someone isn't feeling well. Mr. Hansen, I want you to listen to me very carefully. I never signed that document. I was never in your office 6 months ago. And if you participated in creating fraudulent legal papers, you're going to lose your license and probably face criminal charges." The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if he had hung up on me. "Mrs. Williams," he said finally, his voice much less confident, "perhaps we should meet in person to discuss this matter. I think there may have been some misunderstandings." "The only misunderstanding," I interrupted, "is that you and my son thought you could steal my house and get away with it. I'll be speaking to the State Bar Association this afternoon, and I suggest you start looking for a good criminal defense attorney." I hung up before he could respond, my heart pounding with adrenaline and something that felt remarkably like triumph. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I was fighting back effectively. The call to Adult Protective Services was more difficult, not because the caseworker wasn't helpful, but because talking to them made the reality of my situation undeniably clear. I was a 73-year-old woman who had been financially abused by her own son, and I needed protection from someone who was supposed to love and care for me. "Mrs. Williams," the caseworker said, "cases like yours are more common than you might think. Adult children who view their parents' assets as their inheritance often convince themselves they're justified in taking control of those assets prematurely. The good news is that if we can prove fraud, we can not only stop the sale but potentially recover any money that's already been taken." "Money that's already been taken?" "You mentioned that your son has been handling your finances for the past 2 months. We'll need to audit all your accounts to make sure he hasn't been helping himself to your savings." The thought of James stealing from my bank accounts on top of everything else made me feel physically sick. How much of my financial security had already been compromised? How long had he been planning this systematic theft of my independence? I spent the rest of Friday gathering additional evidence and building my case. I drove to Dr. Chen's office and obtained copies of my medical records, proving exactly when I had been in treatment and confirming my mental competency throughout my illness. I visited Mrs. Patterson, who had returned from Florida the previous week, and got a sworn statement that she had never witnessed any legal documents at Derek Hansen's office. Most importantly, I went to the bank where I had done business for 35 years and requested account statements for the past 6 months. What I found there was devastating. James had been systematically draining my accounts. Small amounts at first, $50 or $100 that could be explained as legitimate expenses. But in the past month, the withdrawals had grown larger and more frequent. Grocery bills for amounts far exceeding what one elderly woman could possibly eat. medical expenses for treatments I had never received, home maintenance costs for repairs that had never been done. In total, he had stolen almost $15,000 from my savings, money I had worked for decades to accumulate, money I had planned to use for genuine emergencies or to leave to him in my will after my natural death. The bank manager, a woman named Patricia who had handled my mortgage 20 years ago, was horrified when I explained the situation. "Mrs. Williams, I should have caught this. The pattern of withdrawals was suspicious, but since your son was listed as an authorized user on the account, our system didn't flag it for review. When was he added as an authorized user?" Patricia consulted her computer screen, her expression growing more troubled. 2 months ago. The paperwork shows your signature, but... She paused, studying the screen more carefully. "Mrs. Williams, this is very strange. The signature card was processed, but there's no record of you coming into the bank that day. Usually we require in-person verification for adding authorized users, but somehow this one was approved without it." Another piece of the puzzle fell into place. James hadn't just forged the power of attorney, he had been forging my signature on bank documents as well, gradually gaining access to every aspect of my financial life. "Can you freeze the accounts immediately?" "Absolutely." "And Mrs. Williams?" "I'm going to file a report with our fraud department and the police. What's been done to you is criminal, and there will be consequences." By the time I returned to the motel that evening, I had built a comprehensive case against James and Derek Hansen. I had medical records proving my mental competency, witness statements contradicting the claims in the forged documents, bank records showing systematic theft, and expert analysis of the signature forgeries. But more than that, I had discovered something important about myself. I was stronger than I had realized, more capable of fighting for my rights than I had ever imagined. The frightened, confused woman who had answered the phone yesterday morning was gone, replaced by someone determined to reclaim her life and see justice done. Sarah Martinez called me back that evening, and after I explained everything I had uncovered, her voice carried a note of excitement. "Mrs. Williams, you've done excellent investigative work. Based on what you've told me, I'm confident we can not only stop the house sale but also press criminal charges against your son and his accomplice. I've filed for an emergency restraining order that will freeze all your assets and prevent any further transactions until we can sort this out legally." "What happens to James?" "That depends on how far he's willing to push this. If he's smart, he'll accept that he's been caught and try to negotiate a plea agreement. If he's stubborn, he could be looking at multiple felony charges for elder abuse, fraud, and theft." After I hung up with Sarah, I sat in the uncomfortable motel chair and tried to process the emotional whirlwind of the past 2 days. I felt victorious and heartbroken at the same time, proud of my strength but devastated by my son's betrayal. James called my cell phone at 11:30 that night, his voice tight with panic. "Mom, what have you done? Derek says you're threatening to have us arrested, and the bank called me about some kind of fraud investigation. You need to stop this right now before you make things worse for everyone." "I've made things worse?" I couldn't keep the incredulity out of my voice. "James, you stole my house and my money. You were planning to have me declared mentally incompetent and locked away in a nursing home. How exactly could I make this situation worse?" "By destroying our family over money." "Mom, we can work this out. I'll pay back what I took from your accounts, and we can find you a nice place to live that's not as expensive as Sunset Manor. But if you keep pursuing these criminal charges, you're going to lose your son forever." The emotional manipulation was so transparent, so calculated, that it made me angry rather than sad. "I lost my son the moment you decided to steal from me," I said. "The person I'm talking to now isn't the child I raised. That boy died sometime in the past few months, and I don't know who replaced him." "Mom, please. I made some bad decisions because I was desperate, but I never wanted to hurt you. Can't we find a way to fix this?" For just a moment, I heard an echo of the little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, the teenager who had cried on my shoulder when his girlfriend broke up with him, the young man who had held my hand at his father's funeral and promised to take care of me forever. But then I remembered the cold calculation in his voice when he had explained his need for money, the casual way he had threatened to have me committed, the months of systematic deception and theft. The time to fix this was before you forged my signature on legal documents, I said. The time to fix this was before you stole $15,000 from my bank account. The time to fix this was before you tried to sell my house without my knowledge or consent. I hung up before he could respond, turned off my phone, and tried to get some sleep. The next morning, Saturday, should have been the day James packed up my belongings and forced me to move to Sunset Manor. Instead, it was the day I returned to my house with a police escort and a locksmith to change all the locks. Officer Rodriguez, who had been assigned to my case, was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense attitude toward elder abuse. "Mrs. Williams," she said as we walked through my front door, "I want you to know that cases like yours are a priority for our department. Financial exploitation of elderly people is becoming increasingly common, and we take it very seriously. What happens now? Now we wait for your son to realize that his scheme has been exposed and decide how he wants to handle it. He can cooperate with our investigation and try to make restitution, or he can dig in his heels and face the full consequences of his actions." As if summoned by our conversation, James appeared in my driveway just as the locksmith was finishing installing new deadbolts on all the exterior doors. He looked terrible, his usually perfect hair disheveled and dark circles under his eyes suggesting he hadn't slept any better than I had. He started toward the front door, then stopped when he saw Officer Rodriguez's patrol car. "Mom," he called out, his voice carrying a note of desperation, "we need to talk." "Any talking you want to do can happen through lawyers," Officer Rodriguez said, stepping between James and the house. "You're not welcome on this property without the owner's permission. She's my mother. This is my family home." "Actually, sir, it's not. This house belongs to Mrs. Williams, and she's made it clear that you're not welcome here. If you try to enter the property or contact Mrs. Williams directly, you'll be arrested for harassment and trespassing." James looked at me over the officer's shoulder, his expression cycling through anger, hurt, and something that might have been genuine remorse. "Mom, I know I screwed up, but you're still my mother. Are you really going to have me arrested?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Was I prepared to see my only child led away in handcuffs? Was I willing to testify against him in court, to see him sentenced to prison time for what he had tried to do to me? 2 days ago, the answer would have been no. 2 days ago, I would have found some way to rationalize his behavior, to convince myself that he had acted out of love rather than greed. I would have been the enabling mother, sacrificing my own well-being to protect a child who had long since stopped deserving my protection. But that was before I understood the full scope of his betrayal. That was before I realized how little my happiness and security meant to him compared to his own financial problems. "Yes," I said, my voice steady and clear. "If that's what it takes to stop you from destroying my life, then yes." James stared at me for a long moment, as if he were seeing me for the first time. Then he turned and walked back to his car without another word. He was arrested 3 days later at his apartment, charged with elder fraud, forgery, and theft. Derek Hansen was arrested the same day on charges of conspiracy and notary fraud. The local newspaper ran a story about the case that made me simultaneously proud of my courage and deeply embarrassed about my family's dirty laundry being aired in public. Linda flew out from Phoenix to stay with me for a week, helping me sort through the legal paperwork and providing the emotional support I needed to get through the most difficult period of my life. We spent hours talking about James, trying to understand how the sweet, loving child we both remembered had become someone capable of such calculated cruelty. "You know what I think?" Linda said one evening as we sat in my living room, the same room where James had tried to justify his theft. "I think he started believing his own lies. He convinced himself that you were incapable of living independently, that he was doing you a favor by taking control of your life. It made it easier for him to rationalize stealing from you. But how could he think I was incapable? I've been managing my own affairs perfectly well for 15 years since Harold died. Because he needed to think it. James always was good at convincing himself that whatever he wanted was actually the right thing to do. Remember when he was 16 and he totaled Harold's truck? He spent 3 hours explaining to us how it was actually the other driver's fault, even though he was the one who ran the red light. I did remember that incident, and dozens of others like it. James had always been charming and persuasive, able to talk his way out of trouble and shift blame to other people or circumstances. I had thought it was just teenage behavior that he would outgrow, but apparently it had evolved into something much more dangerous. The legal proceedings took months to resolve. James initially tried to maintain his innocence, claiming that I had indeed signed the power of attorney and was simply too confused to remember it. But the evidence against him was overwhelming, and eventually his lawyer convinced him to accept a plea agreement. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 18 months if he made full restitution for the money he had stolen. Derek Hansen received 2 years and the loss of his law license. I testified at both sentencing hearings, something I never thought I would have to do. Standing in that courtroom and describing how my own son had systematically violated my trust and stolen my security was one of the most difficult things I had ever done. But it was also empowering. For months, I had felt like a victim, someone whose life had been turned upside down by forces beyond my control. Speaking truth to power, holding my son accountable for his actions, reminded me that I had agency in my own story. James looked at me throughout my testimony, his expression unreadable. When I finished speaking, he asked the judge if he could address the court. "Your Honor," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I want my mother to know that I never meant for things to go this far. I made some terrible decisions when I was desperate, and I hurt the person who loved me most in the world. I don't expect her to forgive me, but I want her to know that I'm sorry." It was the first genuine apology I had heard from him, and despite everything that had happened, it broke my heart. This was still my child, the baby I had rocked to sleep and the young man I had been so proud of. His choices had destroyed our relationship, but they couldn't erase the love I had felt for him or the dreams I had once had for his future. After the sentencing, James's lawyer approached me in the courthouse hallway. "Mrs. Williams, James asked me to give you this," he said, handing me a sealed envelope. "He also wanted me to tell you that he signed over his interest in his father's life insurance policy to help with the restitution payments." I waited until I got home to open the letter. It was 3 pages long, handwritten in the careful script James had learned in Catholic school, and it was the most honest communication I had received from him in years. "Mom," it began, "I know there's nothing I can say that will undo what I've done to you, but I need you to understand how sorry I am. I need you to know that the person who tried to steal your house isn't who I want to be, and it's not who Dad raised me to be. I started making bad financial decisions about 5 years ago, right after my divorce. I was angry and hurt, and I made some investments that were really just gambling. When those failed, I borrowed money to try to win it back. When the loans came due, I borrowed more money from different sources. Before I knew it, I was drowning in debt and couldn't see any way out. When I moved back to town, I told myself it was to be closer to you, to help take care of you the way I promised Dad I would. But if I'm being honest, part of me was already thinking about the house, about how much equity was tied up in it while you lived there alone. I started small, just borrowing a little money from your accounts when I was desperate. I told myself I would pay it back as soon as my business turned around. But my business never turned around, and the amounts I took kept getting bigger. The power of attorney was Derek's idea. He said it would be easy to create the paperwork, that we could make it look legitimate, and that by the time anyone questioned it, the house would be sold and I'd have enough money to disappear and start over somewhere else. I know how that sounds. I know it makes me sound like a sociopath who never loved you. But Mom, I did love you. I do love you. I just loved money more, and I hated being a failure more than I valued being your son. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't expect you to visit me in prison or welcome me back into your life when I get out. I just want you to know that you were right to fight back, right to have me arrested, right to protect yourself from someone who had lost the right to call himself your son. I'm going to spend the next few years trying to figure out how I became the kind of person who could steal from his own mother. And if I ever get the chance, I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to make it up to you. I love you, Mom. I'm sorry I forgot how to show it. Your son, James. I read the letter 3 times, crying harder with each reading. It was the apology I had needed to hear, the acknowledgement of responsibility I had hoped for, the expression of remorse that might someday make healing possible. But it was also a goodbye letter, the final communication from a relationship that could never be repaired. James was right that he had lost the right to call himself my son. He was also right that I might never be able to forgive him, no matter how sorry he claimed to be. I folded the letter carefully and put it in the jewelry box where I had once kept my emergency cash, next to Harold's wedding ring and the watch that had belonged to my father. Someday, maybe years from now, I might be ready to read it again. But for now, it was enough to know that somewhere underneath the greed and desperation, the boy I had raised still existed. The months that followed were a mixture of relief and profound loneliness. I had won my fight to keep my home and my independence, but the victory had cost me my relationship with my only child. I was proud of my strength and resilience, but I was also grieving the loss of the future I had imagined, the golden years spent enjoying my son's company and watching him build a family of his own. Linda visited regularly, and I developed closer relationships with my neighbors and old friends from church. I started volunteering at the library and joined a book club for seniors. Slowly, I began to build a new life that didn't revolve around waiting for James to call or visit. But the real healing began when I started speaking publicly about elder fraud. Sarah Martinez asked me to testify before a state legislative committee that was considering new protections for elderly people, and my story helped pass a law requiring additional verification for power of attorney documents. I started speaking at senior centers and community groups, sharing my experience and teaching other elderly people how to protect themselves from financial predators. It was empowering to turn my painful experience into something that might prevent other families from going through what James and I had endured. The hardest thing to accept, I would tell these audiences, is that the people most likely to exploit elderly people are their own family members. We want to trust our children, and that trust makes us vulnerable. But protecting yourself isn't about not loving your family. It's about loving yourself enough to maintain boundaries. 2 years after James's sentencing, I received another letter from him. This one was shorter, less dramatic, but somehow more meaningful. "Mom," he wrote, "I know I don't have the right to ask for updates about your life, but I hope you're doing well. I hope you're still living in the house and that you've found ways to be happy. I've been working in the prison library, and I've been reading a lot about financial crimes and the psychology behind them. I'm starting to understand some things about myself that I didn't want to face before. I've also been attending counseling sessions and working with a chaplain here. I'm not trying to make excuses for what I did, but I'm trying to understand how I became someone capable of hurting you the way I did. I know you probably don't want to hear from me, and I understand if you don't respond to this letter. But I wanted you to know that I think about you every day, and that I'm genuinely trying to become a better person. If you ever feel ready to hear from me again, I would be grateful for the chance to talk to you. If not, I understand that too. Love, James." I kept that letter for 3 weeks before I responded. When I finally wrote back, it was just a short note letting him know that I was well, that I was still living in the house, and that I was proud of him for getting counseling and trying to understand his actions. "I'm not ready for regular correspondence," I wrote, "but I'm glad to know that you're working on yourself. That's the first step toward becoming someone who deserves forgiveness." It wasn't reconciliation, but it was a beginning. Maybe someday, if James continued to grow and change, we might be able to rebuild some version of a relationship. It would never be the same as what we had lost, but it might be something honest and real. In the meantime, I was learning to be proud of the life I had built for myself. I was 75 years old, living independently in the home I had fought to keep, surrounded by friends who valued my wisdom and courage. I had discovered strengths I never knew I possessed and had turned my greatest betrayal into a source of purpose and meaning. My house on Maple Street was exactly where I belonged, and no one would ever take it from me again.